Long-term media.
Did you know that the largest proportion of oil imports in the US don't come from the Middle East, but from Canada? In 2018, Canada supplied the US with almost 40% of the total oil imports, with second-place Saudi Arabia coming in at only a third of that. This is because Canada actually has the third-largest proven oil reserves in the world, beating out some of the most well-known oil-rich countries including Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and the UAE. In fact, the only Middle Eastern country that beats out Canada is Saudi Arabia, with first place going to Venezuela. Not only does Canada have the most oil, it also has the most potassium, the second most uranium, the fourth most nickel, and plenty of other natural resources. But in countries like Saudi Arabia, the oil and gas sector accounts for about 50% of their gross domestic product, while in Canada, oil products, natural gas, and electricity combined only contribute to 10%. You could perhaps say for Venezuela, bad management and political turmoil have limited its growth. But Canada is one of the most developed nations in the world, even beating out the US on the Human Development Index. Now don't get me wrong here, Canada is already one of the wealthiest nations in the world. But when we think of Canada, why don't we think of Saudi princes, Lamborghini police, or at the very least oil? In other words, why is resource-rich Canada not flamboyantly rich like the Middle East? There are a couple reasons for this. One is government involvement. If we look at Saudi Arabia, the country's largest oil company, Saudi Aramco, is the most profitable company in the world. The Saudi royal family owns the company that generated $111 billion in net income last year. This is equivalent to the profits generated by Apple, Google, and ExxonMobil combined. Aramco was actually an American company established by Standard Oil Company, now Exxon, in the late 1930s. It took the company several years to find oil reserves, but when it did, several oil giants would pour in millions of dollars and buy stakes in the company. This continued all the way up until 1973, when the Saudi Arabian government had made enough money from royalties to begin an aggressive buyout of the company, and by 1988, they were able to acquire the entire company, renaming it Saudi Aramco. It's no wonder Saudi Arabia is so rich, considering the government owns the most profitable company in the world. And this same thing applies to all oil-rich nations of the Middle East. Iran has the National Iranian Oil Company, Kuwait has the Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, even Venezuela has Petrolos de Venezuela. Canada does not have a state oil company, meaning that the provincial governments are solely responsible for the oil industry. This will mean that taxes will be lower and there won't be a need for a royalty tax. Taxes aren't very effective in generating revenue for the government when you consider that they are only 27%. The tax on oil in Saudi Arabia is one of the highest in the world. Taxes used to be 85%, which was later decreased to 50%. However, companies need to pay 20% royalties on top of this. To make matters worse for Canada, there are plenty of tax loopholes and write-offs that make the net revenue tax rate much lower than 27%, like investment, expenses, and operating loss of a mining exploration, which can all be used to deduct taxes for 20 years. Plus, taxes are nowhere as effective as royalties. When one pays a royalty, they have to pay a percentage of their product straight to the owners of the royalty. So even if a company is losing billions of dollars, the owner of the royalty would be making a significant chunk based on the total revenue of the company. Plus, even the select few provinces that do charge royalties don't charge very much, with Alberta previously charging just 1%, which has since been increased to 9%. Well, that's why Canada doesn't do as well off of oil. There is no vertical integration, and that means that different sectors are owned by different people. Middle Eastern companies own everything from extraction of oil to sale of oil to companies like Shell or Exxon. In Western companies, vertical integration is heavily frowned upon as it creates a monopoly. One of the most famous examples of vertical integration is the Standard Oil Company, which at its peak, controlled 91% of oil production and 85% of all final sales in the US. This clearly did not go down well with the US Justice Department, who sued the group and forced them to break up into 34 different companies. As you can guess, such antitrust laws prevent Canadian oil companies from building up outlandishly large profit margins just like their Middle Eastern counterparts. But it's not just that. Canadian oil reserves are heavily made up of tar sands or heavy crude oil, which is not only more expensive to refine, but also sells for less than light crude oil. This is because light crude oil is more useful for refineries in making products like gasoline and diesel fuel. Light crude oil is much more prominent in the Middle East, which is perfect for those countries as it is not only cheaper to produce the oil, but it also sells for a higher price. As for Canada, the opposite is true. Not only is it more expensive to produce oil, but it also sells for a cheaper price. And to make things even worse, Canadian oil is harder to extract as they are located far below the surface with hundreds of feet of overburden, making it very tough as well as expensive to get to. Not to mention the heavy crude oil is much worse for the environment. But despite all of these obstacles, none of these are the true reason Canada isn't unimaginably wealthy. Canada could have become a world leader in oil if they wanted to, most likely beating out even the Middle East due to their much greater political stability. And the number one reason they haven't is because of choice. If the Canadian government really prioritized generating wealth, they could have easily started a government-funded vertically integrated project that would have great profit margins and produce billions of dollars of income every year. And this money could be split by a rich ruling family, but Canada preferred to maintain a free market economy and promote competition. And this is not to say that Middle Eastern countries did anything wrong, as they were simply in different circumstances. When Saudi Arabia was established in 1932, it was one of the poorest countries in the world, reliant on pilgrimage revenue and limited agriculture. As a result, when oil was discovered, this was their golden opportunity to vastly improve their country and bring it out of the depths of poverty. The leaders of the government and their families who led their country into the new age of prosperity retained most of this wealth, and still do to this day. In other words, they exploited their country's resources to grow. While this may sound selfish and wrong to you, you have to consider their circumstances as well. Either the government takes the oil and exploits it, and the whole country would improve, albeit while creating a vast wealth inequality. Or no one would have gotten it, as no one would be able to afford such a venture. And today, they're diversifying their income to other sources like information technology or transportation and tourism like the UAE, who have significantly reduced their dependence on oil as the world is moving away from our reliance on oil. As for Canada, around the time they discovered oil, they had just gained independence and really didn't have any economic problems. They weren't rich by any means, but they were self-sustainable. They simply didn't need or want to exploit oil or any of their other resources, which would just create monopolies that break corporations with little benefit to consumers or the average citizen. And this is pretty much what has sprung up in Middle Eastern countries today. Sure, there are unimaginably rich people, but most of the population is in extreme poverty. If you look at Middle Eastern countries' GDP per capita or average salary, you'd be misled, as these are heavily influenced by the wealthiest people in these countries. To understand the life of an average person, you have to look at the median salary. For example, if you look at an oil-rich nation like Iran, the GDP per capita is at $5,400. While this is already low, this is heavily inflated by the rich. The estimated median income per household is actually just $885 per year. And this same principle applies to all of the Middle Eastern oil-dependent countries. In Canada, while there is no one as rich as Saudi princes and kings, the median income is a nice $70,336 as of 2015. And there are plenty of rich people in Canada who have more than they could physically spend anyways. So, in the end, Middle Eastern countries and Canada were simply in different positions when they each discovered oil. And as a result, they both made different decisions that seemed most logical at the time. Canada decided to stay out of the oil business and leave it to the free market. And today, this was better for the country in the long term as it helped the average person. Middle Eastern governments, on the other hand, had to exploit their resources as this was their only option to improve their countries. So, it was just different circumstances that led to Canada not indulging in their oil reserves like the Middle East. For the Middle East, that was the best choice they had. But despite that, for Canada, this was definitely the right decision for them. This is it on why oil-rich Canada isn't flamboyantly rich like the Middle East. Hope yous have enjoyed this piece of long-term media.
Long-term media.